Hello everybody, it's Mr. Gaff here, and today we're going to be talking about the women's rights movement, also known as women's suffrage. I usually have like a joke or something here, but not today. We're just going to dive right into this topic. So let me start off by saying that this was a very large movement with a lot of very important people and very important events. By no means will I touch upon every single important person or every single important event. So I'm just going to try and touch on the things that I think are important, knowing that I'll definitely leave somebody out. And I just want to say, I'm sorry. So some of you might actually be sitting there being like, wait, women's rights? Like, wasn't that always a thing? No, it wasn't. It wasn't until 1920 that women started, not even got, but started to get some of the same equal rights as men. They had to fight extremely hard. A lot of men who were in power did not want to give up that power, and they didn't see women as their equals. Looking back, we know that is completely wrong and silly, but that's the way society was at the time. Before women had the right to vote, their role was seen in the household. They were to take care of the children, cook and clean, take care of their husband, and really be seen but not heard. They weren't really allowed to have opinions. They weren't allowed to go to the same schools as men. They weren't allowed the same professions. They really didn't have any of the same opportunities as men had, which is ridiculous. But that's just the way society was until a bunch of strong, determined, and brave women stood up for their rights and started challenging the authority. And this is kind of the brief synopsis of how that happened. Before we move in, I want to start with one vocabulary word, and that word is suffrage. The women's rights movement is often called the women's suffrage movement. So you look at this word suffrage and you might think it has something to do with suffering. I mean, I can't really blame you, right? They look extremely similar, they have the same letters, and they even sound the same. But suffrage is a noun, which means to participate in an election. So suffrage is basically the right to vote. Now, women who were supportive of the women's rights movement were called suffragettes. So again, I'm going to do my best to take you through this long journey that they went through. And we're going to start all the way back in colonial days with one of the first documented champions for women's rights, Abigail Adams, wife of our second president, John Adams. As John Adams was going with the other founding fathers to write the Declaration of Independence, Abigail said one thing to him, and it was, "John, remember the ladies." What does she mean? Well, the men who were in charge of writing the Declaration of Independence and the new laws for our country, she wanted to tell her husband, who relied on her a lot and valued her input a ton, that, hey, when you guys are doing this, don't forget about us, please. And what happened? Well, they wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." Darn it, John! Now, don't get mad at John. It wasn't John's fault. It was how society was at the time. We know it now to be wrong, but it takes brave people to break down those barriers that exist in our society. A woman's role in society at that time was not to govern, was not to vote, was not to hold an important job. It was to stay home and take care of all the household duties. We know it's not fair, but that was it. So John and the founding fathers at the time did unfortunately forget the ladies. Now let's flash forward more than 70 years to 1848, when a group of women and men who were sympathetic to their cause held a gathering or a convention in Seneca Falls, New York. Now, at this convention, one of the leaders of the women's suffrage movement unveiled her document, which would become the framework of the entire movement. Her name was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and this document was called the Declaration of Sentiments. Elizabeth Cady Stanton modeled the Declaration of Sentiments after the Declaration of Independence. In the Declaration of Sentiments, Elizabeth Cady Stanton outlined the framework for the women's suffrage movement. Really, it can all be centered around equality. They weren't really crazy ideas to us now. Right? If you looked at it and read it, you'd be like, well, that's simple. Why is that not a thing? Well, it wasn't. In it, it basically said that women should have equality. They should have the same opportunities as men, whether that is in terms of school or in terms of career choices. They should have the same rights as men. They should have the right to own property. They should have the right to vote. And their value or rights as a person should not be tied to the men in their lives. A woman should not be owned by a man. Independent, free thinkers who have a voice in their own government. And you're probably like, I mean, yeah. So at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton unveiled this document. As I said, it was the framework for the women's suffrage movement. Now, there were about 100 people there who signed the document. Not all of them were women either. Some of them were men. It wasn't that every man was opposed to women having equal rights. It was just that the majority of men wanted to hold on to their power. If you think about any situation in history, those in power don't like to give up that power, right? When you're at the top, things are pretty good. To be honest, the men at the time feared the women. That's what this whole thing was about. They feared what might happen if women were allowed to vote, if women could have the same opportunities. They didn't want the competition. I'm sorry, dudes, but they were scared. I mean, that's really it. They were just scared of what the women could accomplish if they were given the same opportunity. After the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton became one of the faces of the women's suffrage movement. Later, she ran into a person called Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony shared a lot of the same sentiments or ideals that Cady Stanton did. What's really great about this is that Susan B. Anthony was a great speaker, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, well, she really wasn't. So what would happen usually is that Elizabeth Cady Stanton would write a speech, and Susan B. Anthony would deliver it. She was a great speaker, a great orator. She knew how to fire people up and get people on the same side. There's a famous quote from Elizabeth Cady Stanton where she says, "I fashion the thunderbolts, and Susan fires them." So she creates the words and all the powerful statements, and Susan goes out there and throws them to the crowd of people. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were a really great team, and they were the strongest voices in the women's suffrage movement at the beginning. After the Seneca Falls Convention, the women's suffrage movement gained a little steam. At this time, the country was going through a lot of turmoil. This is right before the Civil War. So any momentum that was built up before this kind of got halted by the whole country fighting itself thing. I do want to mention the connection between the women's rights movement and the abolitionist movement. There were two groups of people fighting for equality at this time in our country. Abolitionists wanted to get rid of slavery and make sure that all African Americans were treated fairly. Women wanted to stop being oppressed by men and also get the right to vote. Now, these two fights were by no means the same. There were very different variables on each side, but they did share one common goal, which was equality. Because of that, abolitionists and suffragettes would support each other in their cause. One of the largest and most powerful voices in the abolitionist movement was Frederick Douglass, and he and Susan B. Anthony actually became pretty good friends. They each wanted the same thing, which was equality. Another famous abolitionist by the name of Sojourner Truth was fighting two battles. She wanted equal rights for all African Americans, but she also wanted equal rights for women. She was fighting the fight on both sides. So now the Civil War has ended and the 15th Amendment is passed, giving African American men the right to vote. The 15th Amendment caused a huge rift between the abolitionist movement and some of the suffragettes. The women's rights movement split into two sides. One side, led by Lucy Stone, was supportive of the abolitionists and happy for them. Another side, with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were a little bit bitter and they didn't actually take it so well. So while they at first shared a lot of the same ideals, at this point they kind of split. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony continued to campaign across the country in order to gather support. Things slowly but surely started to change, little by little. Now, it was actually an interesting trend with how this all developed, and that was as the country was expanding and more states and territories were being formed out west, women's rights were given more equitably to the states in the west. Why do you think that is? Well, they wanted people to come. Wyoming was the first territory to adopt women's suffrage in 1869. Now, it wasn't a state yet, it was just a territory, but still, it gave incentive to women who were maybe fed up in other parts of the country to move out west. They needed new settlers, so what is one of the ways they did that? They advertised more equal rights. And this was a trend that continued throughout the entire movement. States and territories in the western United States gave women more rights at a quicker rate. Now, the first amendment to give women the right to vote was actually proposed in Congress in 1878. We know now that it didn't pass until 1920. And actually, when it was passed, the document wasn't very different. In 1890, Wyoming went from being a territory to becoming an actual state, making it the first state to grant women's suffrage in the entire country. Next, we have a flurry of western states granting women's suffrage. Up next in 1893 was Colorado. In 1896, we have Utah and Idaho. Then in 1910, we have Washington State. California in 1911. In 1912, we have Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona adopting women's suffrage. And this is actually the first time it is supported by a presidential nominee on their ticket. Theodore Roosevelt supports women's suffrage in his campaign. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. It's 1912. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony started this fight in 1848. And yes, unfortunately, this is one of the saddest things about this entire movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony never got to see all their hard work fulfilled. Both of them died before 1920, before the amendment was actually passed. From 1890 to 1920, new people took up the charge in the fight for women's rights. Now, this is called the progressive era of the women's suffrage movement. In this era, the movement becomes more visible to the public. Marches are held, pickets, signs, they start to make their cause more widely visible. And understandably, they've been fighting this fight for over 50 years. Alice Paul is one of the main leaders of the second half of the women's suffrage movement. So in 1913, Lucy Burns and Alice Paul organized a massive march in Washington, D.C., one day before the inauguration of the new president, Woodrow Wilson. They timed it that way so that it would be extremely visible. Now, up until this time, the movement was based mainly on speeches, but this was the first big hi-ya demonstration. All the suffragists who support the same cause coming together to march. Now, because they were starting to become more visible, those in power realized that this actually might be a threat that needs to be taken seriously. Because of that, men in power launched a smear propaganda campaign against any woman who was seeking equality. This just means that in political cartoons, speeches, and papers, they tried to make it seem that what they wanted was not in the best interest of women. They were telling them that they were unladylike and that they didn't know their place. Way to prove the girl's point, boys. Now, of course, Lucy Burns, Alice Paul, and the thousands of other women who were seeking equality did not buckle under this pressure. In 1915, 40,000 women flooded the streets of New York City and marched in protest. Many of them were wearing white and holding a sign from the state that they were from. Now, this was a massive demonstration and got all the attention of major newspapers and publishing outlets. They were getting their message out there, and this was exactly what they wanted. Now, of course, the powers that be, or those in power, did everything at this time to stop the movement from happening. They arrested picketers, they threw them in prison, they were violent with them, they harassed them verbally, and as I said earlier, they harassed them in the newspapers in really any way that they could. What a bunch of crazies. No! Just regular people who wanted rights. In 1916, Jeannette Rankin was elected to Congress, and a couple of years later, she reopened the suffrage amendment. Finally, in 1919, the Senate passes the 19th Amendment, which, among other things, gives women the right to vote. Finally, after many hard-fought battles and many years of fighting, August 26, 1920, the amendment is officially adopted as part of the Constitution. Now, we all know after the 19th Amendment passed, it wasn't just like, boom, everybody's treated equal and everyone has equal rights. That's just not the way it is. There are still battles being fought by different groups in this country for equal treatment today. However, this was a great start. And this was all because a bunch of determined, strong, and brave women stood up to a giant and said, enough's enough, I deserve this. They kept fighting. And because of that, they won. And it's just a really inspirational story for us all. So, that's it for today. I hope everybody enjoyed this. Like I said, I know I probably missed a few things, and I'm sorry about that, but I did the best I could. So I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.